Mason's old work jacket still smelled faintly of engine grease when he walked into the luxury dealership, hoping only to buy a safe sedan for his rideshare work. Madison, the showroom's most polished saleswoman, glanced at his scuffed boots and laughed in front of a crowd of wealthy customers. "You can't afford this car," she sneered, loud enough for everyone to hear. Mason said nothing, his knuckles tightening around the folder in his hand. What Madison never imagined was that the quiet man she had just humiliated had arrived to sign the papers that would make the entire dealership his. Stay with this story, because Mason's quiet answer to that insult will soon bring the whole dealership to its knees. Mason was a quiet, single father who had spent most of his adult life with his hands buried in engines, learning every wire and sensor of modern vehicles, until he could diagnose a fault before most technicians even opened the hood. He did not dress like a man of means. His jacket was faded, his boots were worn thin at the heel, and his palms carried the permanent stain of years spent under hoods and inside transmissions. He was never the kind of man who wanted to announce his success. After years of grinding work, Mason had designed a diagnostic tool for electric and hybrid vehicles, a small piece of engineering that solved problems larger companies had struggled with for years. A major transportation firm eventually purchased the rights to his invention, and the payout was substantial. Yet Mason did not change his lifestyle. He did not buy a mansion or a fleet of sports cars. Instead, he began quietly investing in struggling businesses, the kind that still had good people inside them but were being run into the ground by poor leadership. Langford Auto Gallery had once been a respected name in the region, a dealership known for fair deals and honest service. Under new management, that reputation had eroded. Sales numbers were falling, the bank was circling, and the culture inside the building had shifted towards something colder. Madison was the star saleswoman of the showroom, strikingly confident and undeniably skilled at closing deals, but she had come to believe that only wealthy-looking customers deserved her attention. Jackson, the showroom manager, protected her because her numbers kept his own performance reviews looking good, and he rarely questioned how she treated the people who walked through the door. Joseph, the aging owner, still cared deeply about the name his family had built, but he had grown tired, and he had lost his grip on the culture festering beneath him. Amelia was the attorney guiding Mason through the quiet acquisition, and she understood that before any final signature touched paper, Mason wanted to see the truth of the place with his own eyes. He did not want a spreadsheet version of the dealership. He wanted to know how it treated an ordinary person walking in off the street. His reasons were practical rather than sentimental. He needed a dependable sedan for his daily work and for his family's needs, though his home life stayed mostly in the background of his thinking that day. What mattered most to him was simple. He had spent enough years being underestimated to recognize when a business had forgotten the value of the people it served, and he intended to find out exactly how deep that forgetting had gone before he ever signed his name. Mason arrived at the dealership on a quiet afternoon while a light rain misted the parking lot outside. Inside, the showroom gleamed under bright overhead lighting. Rows of polished vehicles, arranged like sculptures, salespeople in tailored suits drifting between wealthy customers who sipped coffee from branded cups. Mason walked past the entrance without hesitation and stopped in front of a black sedan, not the most expensive model on the floor, but a vehicle he had researched carefully for months. He wanted to know its maintenance history, its warranty coverage, its common mechanical issues, and whether the inspection records were complete and honest. A young salesman near the entrance noticed him first and started forward to help, but Madison raised a hand and stepped in before he could reach him. She looked Mason over slowly, taking in the faded jacket, the worn boots, the folder tucked under his arm, and something in her expression shifted from professional courtesy to quiet dismissal. She asked, in a voice cooler than the one she used with the couple browsing nearby, whether he had an appointment. Mason answered calmly that he wanted to look at the sedan and that he could complete payment that same day if everything checked out. Madison let out a short laugh, as though he had told a joke rather than stated a fact. She told him that the vehicles in this section of the showroom were not meant for people who were simply browsing out of curiosity. A well-dressed couple standing near a convertible overheard the exchange and chuckled along with her, and the small sound of their laughter made the moment sting even more. Mason kept his voice even and asked if she could open the door so he could examine the interior. Madison refused outright, saying the dealership did not allow people to handle vehicles they could not realistically afford. Mason understood in that moment that the problem was not isolated to one employee having a bad day. It was something woven into the culture of the entire building. He glanced toward the security cameras mounted near the ceiling, toward the reception desk where two employees pretended not to notice what was happening, and toward the other salespeople who kept their eyes fixed on their own customers rather than step in. Nobody moved to correct Madison. Nobody offered him so much as an apologetic glance. The silence around him told him everything he needed to know about how deeply this attitude had settled into the people who worked there every day, and how normal it must have felt to them by now. He did not raise his voice or demand an apology. He simply stood there for a moment longer, absorbing the way the room worked, memorizing the faces that looked away and the ones that smiled to his expense. It was not pride that kept him calm. It was patience, the same patience that had carried him through years of being underestimated in far harder circumstances than this one. Whatever Madison believed about him in that instant, Mason already knew something she did not, and the folder under his arm felt heavier than it had a few minutes earlier. He thought briefly of every job he had walked into wearing clothes that did not match the room, every interview where a manager's eyes lingered too long on his hands before ever reaching his face. None of that bitterness showed on his expression now. He simply filed the moment away, the way he had always filed away small injustices, as information rather than injury. Somewhere behind the tailored suits and gleaming paint, a decision had already been made without anyone in that showroom realizing it, and nothing Madison said next would change what was coming. Madison raised her voice slightly, just enough for the words to carry across the open floor of the showroom. She suggested, with a thin smile, that Mason might have better luck at the used car lot near the edge of town, the one with faded flags and prices scrawled on the windshields in white paint. Mason asked her once more, evenly, whether she would treat him with the same professionalism she offered every other customer if he could prove he was able to pay in full. Madison laughed again, louder this time, and delivered the line that would follow her for the rest of her career. "You can't afford this car," she said, and for a moment the entire showroom seemed to hold its breath. Jackson emerged from his glass-walled office at the sound of the commotion, but rather than diffuse the situation, he made it worse. He asked Madison what was happening, and she quickly reshaped the story, claiming that Mason had been bothering a VIP customer and had tried to open a vehicle without permission. Mason did not raise his voice to correct her. He simply asked, calmly, whether he could speak with someone above her in the chain of command. Jackson looked him over exactly the way Madison had, drawing the same conclusions from the same worn jacket and tired boots, and sided with his top salesperson without hesitation. Jackson told Mason it would be best if he left before security had to be called. Mason reached into his jacket and produced a simple business card, plain and unadorned, bearing only his name and a phone number with no title beneath it. Jackson glanced at it, decided it looked like something printed at a corner shop, and tossed it onto the counter without a second thought. Nearby, a customer named Ryan, who had been preparing to finalize a purchase of his own, watched the entire exchange with a deepening frown, uncomfortable with the way the staff had turned on a stranger who had done nothing but ask a few reasonable questions. Madison, emboldened by Jackson's support, pushed further. She told Mason plainly that a man dressed the way he was dressed had no business dreaming about a car like the one in front of him. Mason turned to look at her directly, his expression unreadable, and told her that the way she treated customers would eventually cost this dealership more than she could imagine. Madison heard it as an empty threat from a man with nothing to back it up, and she laughed once more before turning back to her VIP guests as though the matter were settled. Mason did not argue further. He walked away from the vehicles, but he did not walk out of the building. Instead, he crossed toward the quiet seating area near the entrance, took a seat, and pulled out his phone. He dialed a short, familiar number and waited only a moment before Amelia answered on the other end. His voice was low, steady, and free of anger when he finally spoke the two words that would end everything Madison and Jackson believed about their positions in that building. "Prepare to sign," he said, and then he hung up the phone and waited, watching the showroom continue exactly as it had before, unaware that its clock had already run out. Ryan lingered near the entrance a moment longer than he needed to, uneasy about the deal he had almost finalized in a room where a stranger could be treated so carelessly. He did not yet understand what he had witnessed, only that something about it felt wrong enough to sit with him for the rest of the day. Behind the glass office, Jackson straightened his tie and told himself the matter was closed, congratulating Madison on handling a difficult situation well. Neither of them noticed the quiet man in the worn jacket rise from his seat, fold his phone into his pocket, and walk calmly toward the back offices where Joseph was already waiting. The scene shifted to a private office at the back of the building, where Joseph sat across from Amelia and Charlotte, a representative from the bank that held the dealership's remaining debt. Joseph looked worn down, older than his years, aware that the business his family had built was slipping out of his hands and into the hands of creditors who cared nothing for its history. Charlotte explained plainly that a small investment firm had quietly acquired the majority of the dealership's outstanding debt, and that the terms now gave the holder of that debt the option to take control of the business entirely, provided Joseph agreed to sell rather than let the bank seize everything through foreclosure. Joseph had no idea that the man behind that investment firm had just spent the last half hour standing in his own showroom, dressed like an ordinary customer, being laughed at by his own staff. Amelia's phone buzzed quietly on the table, and when she read the message from Mason, she understood immediately that his unannounced walk through the showroom floor had reached its conclusion. Mason was not interested in acquiring a business purely to extract profit from it. He wanted to take a place that still had good people inside it and correct the direction it had been heading for years before it became something beyond saving. Joseph admitted with visible weariness that he had built this dealership from almost nothing decades earlier, working long hours himself before eventually stepping back and handing daily operations to Jackson. Since then, he confessed, something had shifted. Ordinary customers had started leaving frustrated. Skilled mechanics had quietly resigned rather than falsify inspection reports. A handful of vehicles had been sold with incomplete or misleading records, cutting corners that Joseph had once sworn he would never allow under his name. Mason had already reviewed months of financial statements and customer complaints before ever stepping foot inside the building, but he had wanted to witness the culture firsthand rather than rely on numbers alone. Amelia asked Joseph directly whether he understood what signing today would mean, that control of the dealership would pass entirely into Mason's hands by the end of the afternoon. Joseph nodded slowly, saying that if the choice was between watching the bank strip the business for parts or handing it to someone who seemed to actually care about doing right by the people inside it, the decision was not difficult to make. Mason had made clear to Amelia earlier that his resolve had only strengthened after what he had just witnessed on the showroom floor. If a decent person did not step in to change the direction of this place, it would keep hurting more people exactly the way it had hurt him only minutes earlier. Joseph signed the preliminary transfer agreement while Charlotte finalized the details with the bank on a separate line. The paperwork moved quickly through the back offices while, just beyond the wall, Madison and Jackson continued their afternoon completely unaware, still believing they had simply turned away a man who could never have belonged among their wealthy clientele in the first place. Amelia gathered the final set of documents into a single folder and asked Mason, one last time over the phone, whether he wanted to delay the transfer until after normal business hours, sparing the staff the shock of an immediate transition. Mason declined. He told her that the truth of a place was clearest in its ordinary moments, not in a carefully staged announcement scheduled for a quieter day. Joseph, listening from across the desk, allowed himself a tired smile, the first genuine one he had shown in weeks. Grateful that the name above the door might survive after all, even if the hands running the place beneath it were about to change completely. Madison returned to her group of wealthy customers, straightening her blazer and forcing her professional smile back into place as though nothing unusual had happened. The mood in the room, however, had already shifted in ways she did not yet notice. Ryan, still weighing his decision to finalize his purchase, asked her directly why the dealership had treated a customer the way it just had. Madison answered smoothly that they were simply protecting the showroom's inventory from people who had no genuine intention of buying. Ryan did not look satisfied with the answer, and something in his expression told her the conversation was far from over. A couple browsing near the convertibles quietly gathered their things and left without saying goodbye to anyone on staff. The young salesman who had first noticed Mason at the door lowered his eyes, visibly uncomfortable with what he had just watched unfold. Jackson pulled Madison aside near the coffee station, not to reprimand her, but to remind her quietly not to let a minor incident cost them a customer as significant as Ryan. Madison waved off his concern, confident that a man like the one they had just turned away could not possibly matter to their bottom line. She had no idea the showroom's security cameras had captured every second of the exchange in clear, uninterrupted footage. Meanwhile, in the quiet seating area near the entrance, Mason waited patiently as Amelia confirmed over the phone that the paperwork was ready for final signatures. He glanced up at a wall lined with framed photographs celebrating past sales achievements, and among them was a picture of Madison standing at the center of her team, beaming beside a plaque naming her Employee of the Year. Mason felt no satisfaction at what was coming. He did not resent Madison for being wealthy or poor, successful or struggling. What troubled him was simpler than that. She had taken a profession built on trust and turned it into a tool for humiliating people who did not fit her idea of what a valued customer should look like. He thought briefly of his own early years, of interviews where employers had glanced past his resume straight to his rough hands, of nights spent working late shifts to keep his household steady while carrying the quiet weight of responsibilities that never showed on his face. He did not dwell there. It was not the kind of memory he wanted at the center of this moment. Mason had already decided that he would not respond to cruelty with cruelty of his own. Public humiliation for its own sake had never interested him, no matter how satisfying it might feel to some in his position. What he wanted instead was to bring the truth into the light in front of the very people who had participated in Madison's small performance of contempt, so that everyone in that room could see exactly what kind of culture they had been part of building, whether they had realized it or not. Amelia's voice came through the phone again, calm and precise, confirming that Joseph had finished his final review and was ready to move forward whenever Mason gave the word. Mason thanked her quietly and told her he would meet everyone in the back office within a few minutes. He rose from his seat, smoothed the folder under his arm, and took one last look across the showroom floor. At Madison laughing with her clients, at Jackson nodding along beside her, at the framed photographs of a success built on numbers rather than decency. None of them noticed him walk past the glass doors toward the private hallway, and none of them understood yet that the ground beneath their certainty had already shifted. Joseph requested that every employee gather on the showroom floor, announcing only that he had an important update to share before the end of the day. Madison assumed Joseph intended to praise her for handling a difficult customer, perhaps even hold her up as an example of protecting the dealership's image. Jackson felt equally confident, imagining that his loyalty over the years was finally about to be rewarded with expanded authority over daily operations. Neither of them noticed the quiet tension building near the hallway that led to the private offices. Mason stepped out from that hallway alongside Amelia, Charlotte, and Joseph, and the noise of the showroom dropped away almost instantly. Madison froze the moment she recognized the man she had humiliated less than an hour earlier, now standing beside the very owner who had summoned everyone together. Jackson's brow furrowed, and he asked, with more confusion than concern, what this man was doing in a restricted area reserved for staff and ownership. Joseph's expression hardened as he told Jackson plainly that Mason had every right in the world to stand exactly where he was standing. Amelia opened her folder and announced in a clear and steady voice that the transfer of ownership for Langford Auto Gallery had been finalized that afternoon. Mason was now the sole owner of the dealership, its buildings, its inventory, and everyone employed within its walls. A ripple of stunned silence moved through the gathered staff. Madison's face drained of color, and she attempted a nervous laugh, certain for a moment that this had to be some elaborate joke orchestrated to test her patience. Jackson demanded to know why management had not been informed ahead of time about a change of this magnitude. Joseph answered him directly, saying that the very way management had chosen to run this dealership was exactly why he had felt compelled to sell it in the first place. Mason said little during the announcement itself. He reached into his jacket, retrieved the same plain business card Jackson had tossed aside earlier that day, and placed it gently on the hood of the nearest vehicle. He asked Jackson without any trace of anger in his voice whether he still believed that card had been printed at some cheap corner shop. Jackson's composure began to crack for the first time since the ordeal began. Madison tried to offer an explanation, insisting there had been some kind of misunderstanding earlier in the day. Mason did not respond to her directly. Instead, he asked Amelia to pull up the footage from the showroom's own security cameras and display it for everyone present. The mood in the room shifted instantly from arrogance to something closer to dread, as employees who had laughed along with Madison only an hour before began glancing nervously at one another, suddenly uncertain how much of their own behavior that footage might reveal. Joseph stood quietly to the side, watching his staff absorb the news, feeling the strange mixture of relief and grief that comes with letting go of something built over decades. Charlotte remained near the back, ready to answer any questions about the bank's role in the transition, though nobody in the room seemed focused on financial details anymore. Caleb, a young technician who had always kept to himself in the service bay, drifted closer to the gathering, sensing that whatever happened next would matter far beyond the walls of this showroom. Mason simply waited, patient as ever, for the screen behind the reception desk low to the recording that would settle every remaining doubt in the room. The footage began to play across the screen mounted behind the reception desk, and the entire showroom watched in silence as the events of the afternoon unfolded in sharp, undeniable detail. Everyone saw Madison step in front of the young salesman to block him from helping Mason. They heard every mocking remark about his appearance, every question about whether he could possibly afford anything on the floor. Jackson appeared moments later in the recording, tossing the plain business card aside and threatening to summon security over nothing more than a man asking reasonable questions. Madison tried to argue that the footage had been taken out of context, that a few seconds of video could not capture the full situation. Mason asked her calmly what context could possibly justify humiliating a customer in front of an entire room of strangers. Madison had no answer, and the silence that followed said more than any response could have. Ryan, still standing near the edge of the gathering, spoke up unprompted, telling the room that he had witnessed the entire exchange firsthand and had no intention of signing any contract if this was the kind of culture the dealership intended to keep. Caleb stepped forward next, admitting quietly that this was far from the first time Madison had treated a customer this way. He described other visitors who had been turned away or ignored simply because their clothing did not match the showroom's polished image. Grace, an accountant who rarely spoke up in front of the sales floor, added her own account, confirming that Jackson routinely pressured staff to prioritize customers who looked wealthy while brushing aside anyone who did not fit that picture, regardless of whether they were serious buyers. Mason turned to Joseph and asked whether he had known about any of this before today. Joseph admitted with visible pain in his voice that he had heard scattered complaints over the years but had never realized how deeply the problem had taken root inside his own dealership. Mason addressed the room then, his voice calm but carrying enough weight to hold every person's attention. He announced that beginning immediately, no customer would ever again be judged by their clothing, their profession, their age, or their appearance within these walls. Madison lowered her head, seeing for the first time how the very smile she had worn so confidently earlier that day had transformed into evidence used against her. Jackson's mind, meanwhile, seemed less concerned with any wrongdoing than with the sudden and very real threat to his own position within the company. He glanced toward the exit more than once, calculating whether there was still some way to salvage his standing before the situation grew any worse for him. Personally, entirely unconcerned with what Madison might be feeling in that moment beside him. A few of the newer employees exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether to feel relief that someone had finally named the problem out loud or fear that their own past silence might now count against them as well. Amelia quietly closed her folder, having said everything the moment required, and let the weight of the recording speak for itself. Joseph reached up and rubbed his eyes, looking every bit his age, a man watching decades of his life's work being measured against a standard he had let slip without noticing. Mason did not gloat and did not raise his voice again. He simply let the silence stretch, giving everyone in that room the space to sit with exactly what they had allowed to happen under this roof for far longer than any of them wanted to admit. Jackson tried to shift the blame entirely onto Madison, insisting that she had been the one to insult Mason directly while he had only reacted to secondhand reports. Mason reminded him, without raising his voice, that a manager carried responsibility not only when giving orders but also when covering for the wrongdoing of others. He then produced a stack of customer complaints spanning the past several months, many of them bearing Jackson's own signature beside a note dismissing each one as minor and unworthy of further action. Charlotte added that the bank had already flagged concerns about the dealership's reputation long before the acquisition was finalized, concerns that Jackson had apparently chosen to ignore or bury rather than address. Joseph looked at Jackson with an expression closer to disappointment than anger, the look of a man realizing he had trusted the wrong person for far too long. Mason decided, calmly and without theatrics, to suspend Jackson immediately pending a full internal review of his conduct and the complaints tied to his name. With Madison, Mason chose a different path. He did not fire her on the spot simply to satisfy the anger of the room or to make an example of her for dramatic effect. Instead, he laid out clear terms. She would need to submit a written account of what had happened, apologize directly and publicly to the customer she had humiliated, complete a course focused on ethical treatment of customers, and accept a temporary reassignment away from luxury vehicle sales while her conduct was evaluated over the following weeks. Madison's first instinct was humiliation rather than genuine remorse, and her initial apology carried the hollow tone of someone trying to save her job, rather than someone confronting what she had actually done. Mason did not accept it. He told her plainly that she did not owe her apology to her new employer first. She owed it to the customer she had dismissed and mocked in front of an entire room of strangers. The remark landed heavily across the showroom, making it clear to everyone present that Mason had no interest in being praised or thanked. He wanted the dignity of ordinary people restored, nothing more and nothing less. Ryan decided to stay a little longer, curious to see whether this new ownership would actually follow through on the standard it had just set for itself. Caleb watched Mason with something close to quiet admiration, having rarely seen anyone in a position of power stand up so directly for both an honest employee and a customer who had been treated so poorly. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Caleb felt as though the place he worked might finally start to resemble the kind of business he had once believed. It was when he first walked through its doors looking for a job. Grace stayed near the back of the room, quietly relieved that someone had finally connected the complaints she had watched pile up for months to consequences that actually meant something. Joseph excused himself briefly, needing a moment away from the crowd to process the shape of the day, and Amelia followed her to make sure the paperwork for Jackson's suspension was drafted properly before anyone left the building. Madison remained standing near the vehicles she had once treated like trophies, aware for the first time that her reputation inside these walls now depended entirely on actions rather than charm, and that no amount of polish could undo what the room had just witnessed together. Later that evening, Mason sat down privately with Joseph, Amelia, and Caleb in the same back office where the transfer had been finalized only hours earlier. He revealed something none of them had expected. Years before, as a young single father searching desperately for stable work, he had applied for a technician position at this very dealership and been turned away because he did not fit the polished image the brand wanted to project at the time. One kind mechanic, no longer employed there, had quietly lent him old repair manuals, allowing Mason to teach himself far more than any formal training program ever could have. He eventually found work at a small independent garage, where he built a reputation for solving problems that larger, flashier dealerships routinely missed. Over time, he designed a diagnostic tool for battery systems and onboard computers in modern vehicles, a project he had refined during long nights after his shifts ended. A major company eventually purchased the rights to that invention, giving Mason the resources to invest seriously for the first time in his life. He could have bought a bigger house, a faster car, or any number of comforts that most people would consider well-earned after so many years of hard work. Instead, he chose to seek out businesses like this one, places that still had decent people inside them but had drifted away from the values that once defined them, and he worked to repair them rather than simply profit from their decline. Joseph asked him directly whether any part of this had been about revenge against the industry that once turned him away. Mason answered honestly that revenge would only have made him resemble the very people who had dismissed him years earlier. He had not purchased this dealership to settle a personal score. He had purchased it because it still held good employees and genuine customers, and because it deserved a chance to become something better than what it had become under careless leadership. Caleb was offered a temporary position as technical advisor, tasked with overseeing quality standards on the service floor going forward. Grace was asked to review every contract connected to a past customer complaint, searching for patterns that needed correcting immediately rather than quietly buried. Mason also ordered a full audit of every vehicle currently sitting in inventory, insisting that nothing with an incomplete or questionable inspection record would ever again be sold to an unsuspecting customer under his ownership. This conversation gave the entire story its foundation, making clear that Mason's wealth had not appeared from nowhere, but had been earned through genuine skill, careful strategy, and a set of principles he refused to abandon even when it would have been easier to look away. The same principles that had once cost him a job he badly needed to support the people who depended on him. Amelia listened quietly through most of the conversation, having known parts of this history for years, but never hearing Mason speak about it so openly in front of others. Joseph studied him for a long moment, seeing past the worn jacket and calloused hands to the kind of patience and discipline no amount of money could manufacture on its own. He admitted that he wished he had asked harder questions years earlier, before the culture inside his dealership had drifted so far from the standards he once set for himself as a young owner. Mason told him gently that the point now was not to dwell on what had gone wrong, but to build something steadier from what remained, one honest decision at a time, starting with the people already standing in that room. Madison sat alone in the employee break room later that day, stripped for the first time of the confident polish she usually wore like armor. She feared losing her job outright and feared even more that her reputation as a top performer had crumbled in the span of a single afternoon. Grace stepped in quietly, not to scold her further, but simply to point out that countless customers had likely walked away in silence over the years after hearing words very similar to the ones she had aimed at Mason that morning. Madison found herself replaying memory after memory she had never bothered to examine closely before. The time she had rolled her eyes at an elderly customer taking too long to decide. The time she had ignored a tired-looking driver or a mechanic shopping on his day off because neither one matched her idea of a worthwhile sale. Slowly, uncomfortably, she began to understand that her harm had never been limited to a single stranger in a worn jacket. It had been happening quietly, again and again, to people who simply left without ever saying a word about how they had been treated. Mason instructed Madison to personally call 3 customers whose complaints had been filed and dismissed in recent months. It was not an easy assignment, and it was not meant to be. The first call connected her to a woman named Lisa, who answered coldly the moment she heard Madison's name, still carrying the sting of an old humiliation from months earlier. Madison forced herself to apologize without excuses, without softening the truth of what she had done, and without expecting forgiveness in return. Lisa did not offer forgiveness right away, but she did admit, somewhat grudgingly, that it meant something for Madison to finally own her mistake out loud instead of brushing it aside. When the call ended, Madison sat quietly for a long moment before the tears came, not from weakness, but from the strange and uncomfortable clarity of seeing herself honestly for what felt like the first time in years. Mason observed the moment from a distance, but chose not to intervene, understanding that real change rarely came from a lecture and almost always came from sitting with the discomfort of consequences honestly faced. Jackson, in stark contrast, spent that same afternoon making phone calls of his own, trying to rally sympathetic coworkers against the new ownership before his suspension could be finalized. Word of his efforts eventually reached Mason, who recognized immediately that one final confrontation with Jackson remained before the transition could truly be considered complete, and he began quietly preparing for exactly that conversation. Amelia flagged the calls as a potential violation of the terms of Jackson's suspension, quietly gathering records in case the situation escalated further. Joseph, informed of the attempted rally against the new ownership, felt a fresh wave of disappointment settle over him, realizing just how far Jackson's loyalty had always run towards his own interest rather than toward the business or the people inside it. Meanwhile, Madison finished her second and third calls with growing steadiness, each apology a little less rehearsed and a little more honest than the one before it, as though the practice of admitting fault out loud was slowly reshaping the way she thought about the work she had spent years taking for granted. Jackson refused to accept his suspension quietly. He returned to the showroom the following morning and raised his voice to whoever would listen, insisting that Mason was nothing more than a man who had gotten lucky with money and understood nothing about how the car business actually worked. He tried to stir fear among the staff, warning that Mason would slash bonuses, fire employees without warning, and run the dealership into the ground within months. A few of the newer staff members exchanged nervous glances, uncertain whether to believe him. Mason did not respond with anger or raised volume of his own. Instead, he asked Amelia to present the preliminary findings from an internal audit that had been underway since the moment ownership changed hands. The report revealed that Jackson had been quietly padding certain contracts with unnecessary fees, pressuring customers into extended warranty packages they neither needed nor fully understood, and overlooking minor mechanical defects before vehicles were delivered rather than delaying sales to address them properly. Madison felt a fresh wave of unease as she realized she had unknowingly benefited from parts of that same system for years without ever questioning where the extra profit on certain deals had actually come from. Ryan, who happened to be present for the discussion, grew visibly angry upon learning that the contract he had nearly signed days earlier contained one of those same questionable fees buried in the fine print. Jackson attempted to walk out of the meeting entirely, but Joseph stepped in front of him, blocking his path with quiet resolve. Joseph admitted with evident regret that he had placed far too much trust in Jackson for far too long without asking the harder questions that might have caught this sooner. Mason announced that Jackson's employment was terminated effective immediately and that his file would be forwarded to legal counsel should the audit uncover evidence of more serious fraud beyond what had already surfaced. Jackson left the building in a heavy, uncomfortable silence, with no dramatic final confrontation and no physical altercation to punctuate his exit. Mason's victory throughout the entire ordeal had come not from revenge or spectacle, but from patience, documentation, and the quiet exercise of legitimate authority over a business he now controlled outright. Madison watched Jackson's departure and understood something important in that moment. If Mason had truly wanted to destroy her the way Jackson had tried to destroy his own reputation on the way out, He could easily have done so already. Instead, he had chosen to offer her a path that Jackson himself had never been willing to take, a path built on accountability rather than excuses. Charlotte remained afterward to help Amelia finalize the paperwork tied to Jackson's termination, noting quietly that the bank would be relieved to see the dealership's practices brought back into line with proper standards. Grace spent the rest of the afternoon combing through contracts flagged during the audit, cross-referencing each one against Jackson's old notes to determine how many customers might still be owed refunds or corrections. Caleb offered to help wherever needed, grateful that the culture he had quietly tolerated for so long was finally being dismantled from the inside, rather than simply papered over for another year. By the time the sun began to set outside the showroom windows, the building felt different already, lighter somehow, as though a weight it had been carrying for a long time had finally been set down. A month later, Langford Auto Gallery looked and felt like a different place entirely. Customers were no longer sorted by the quality of their clothing or the shine of their shoes the moment they walked through the door. Every vehicle on the floor now carried a complete and transparent inspection record, available for any customer to review before they even considered signing paperwork. Caleb had taken charge of the service department, making certain that nothing left the lot without meeting standards he now enforced personally, rather than quietly working around. Grace had reorganized the entire contract process, stripping out the vague fees and confusing add-ons that had once padded profits at the expense of ordinary buyers. Madison had been reassigned to the customer resolution department, a role far less glamorous than selling luxury vehicles, but one that forced her to genuinely listen to people rather than simply size them up. Slowly, she began to change. She stopped judging customers by their appearance and started paying attention to what they actually needed. Ryan eventually returned to the dealership and completed his purchase, though this time he signed the contract because he trusted the way the business now operated, not merely because of the vehicle itself. Joseph visited the showroom occasionally, quietly moved each time by the sight of his family's name still hanging above the door, save not by erasing its history but by building something more honest on top of it. Mason eventually returned his attention to the same black sedan he had first come to see months earlier. He purchased it, not to prove anything about his wealth, but simply because it remained the vehicle best suited to his everyday needs. Madison was the one who prepared his paperwork for delivery, and before handing over the keys, she offered an apology that finally sounded genuine rather than rehearsed. Mason accepted the keys quietly and told her to remember exactly how this day felt every single time an ordinary customer walked through those doors, looking for nothing more than honesty and respect. Madison nodded, understanding the weight behind his words far more than she would have understood it months earlier. Mason drove away from the dealership as workers outside were quietly installing a new sign above the entrance, one that kept the original family name intact while marking the start of something rebuilt from the ground up. In the end, the dealership had not been saved by Mason's money alone. It had been saved by the dignity he refused to surrender. Even in the moment, he had every reason to feel small. Amelia closed the file on the acquisition that same week, noting quietly to Charlotte that few transactions in her career had felt as meaningful as this one, not because of the size of the deal, but because of what it had managed to repair along the way. Joseph began spending his afternoons mentoring the newer staff members, sharing stories from the dealership's early years and making sure the lessons of the past few months were never quietly forgotten. Caleb and Grace built a simple system for the entire team to flag concerns before they ever grew into the kind of culture that had almost destroyed the business from within. And somewhere on a quiet street outside of town, Mason parked the black sedan in his driveway, stepped out, and allowed himself for just a moment the simple satisfaction of having chosen decency over pride when it would have been so much easier to walk away. Mason never set out to humiliate anyone that day. He simply wanted a fair chance to be treated like a human being, the same chance every person deserves the moment they walk through a door looking for help. What Madison learned, and what the whole dealership eventually learned alongside her, was that real strength never needs to shout, and real power never needs to punish out of anger. Sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one holding everything in their hands. If this story moved something in you, carry its lesson forward into your own life. Judge less by appearances and more by character, because you never truly know who is standing in front of you, or what they are truly capable of building.